Hello, welcome to your very first lesson in facts-based fictional world building. I am your instructor, Dr. Moya McTeer, and welcome to my home, where I do all of my world building and where I will teach you to do the same. The goal of this course is to guide you through the steps of my process for creating a fictional world based on science and facts. If you are thinking of writing a fantasy story, or if you are working on a sci-fi TV show pilot, or if you are designing an adventure video game, if you are doing any sort of creative project where you need to imagine a different world to put your project in, then you are in the right place. Because what I'm going to do with this course is give you the process, the tools, the mindset, and the knowledge that will help you craft worlds from scratch that feel real and textured and like a place where your audience, whoever that may be, can feel like they are immersed in the world that you have created. I am Dr. Moya McTeer. I'm an astrophysicist. I got my PhD in astrophysics studying exoplanets, which are planets outside of our solar system, and what makes them habitable. So I understand how planets form and how they work and what conditions will lead to different types of life or not. And I want to share that knowledge with you. I'm also a folklorist who is specialized in fictional world building. So I understand the stories that people tell, I understand how they use them to connect with the other members of their culture, and how culture can interact with the environment around you. And that is also knowledge that I'm going to share with you. I'm also an author. I wrote a science fiction novel called Lying Hordes that was set on a real exoplanet I studied. I characterized the planet with data from the NASA Kepler Space Telescope, and I had to imagine all of the other texture on that world that the data didn't give me. So it was a real exercise, one of my first, in building a world based on the science that I had available to me. I also wrote a book called The Milky Way, an autobiography of our galaxy, where I talk about the history and evolution of our little corner of space, but from the galaxy's perspective, its point of view. I really had to craft a character, turn the Milky Way galaxy into someone with a personality, with its own unique voice, and that was also an interesting exercise in world building based on the science and facts. I'm a podcaster. I host the podcast Exolore, which examines and explores fictional world building from all angles, but through a lens of science. Sometimes we build our own fictional worlds, sometimes I analyze worlds that others have built, and sometimes I interview world builders to steal their little tricks, and then, of course, because I am a communicator, giving those tricks to you. I'm also a host. I host Fate and Fabled on PBS, which is all about mythology from around the world, understanding the origins of stories and how they connect to the modern day. And through all of that, I am a world builder, a professional imaginer of other worlds. I am constantly mentally inhabiting places that aren't Earth, either because I'm engrossed in a piece of fiction or because I'm trying to build one myself. I'm really comfortable in those spaces. I love thinking about new worlds, and I want to get you comfortable with those spaces too. I want you to get comfortable imagining and thinking about worlds that aren't Earth. So let's start with world building. What is it? What are its bounds? Well, it's actually a really great word because it means exactly what it sounds like it means. It is the process of crafting a fictional world, usually for a piece of speculative fiction, like a fantasy novel or a science fiction TV show or an adventure video game. You know, one of those many possible projects that you are probably working on if you have found this course. I want to touch on the word world there. Often, when we say world, we mean planet, we mean Earth, or something that is very similar to Earth, but like isn't quite it. Or maybe we mean another planet entirely, like Tatooine from Star Wars, or Alderaan from Dune. And that's not all. A world can be a moon. As an astronomer, I know that we are actively looking at the moons around Jupiter and Saturn to see if they can host life. And if they can, then yeah, they can absolutely be a world. You shouldn't be barred from being called a world just because you happen to orbit a planet instead of orbiting a star, right? But you can expand the scope. Maybe a world is a system of planets interconnected, or maybe it's an entire universe. Maybe it's a multiverse. Or you can really shrink the scope. Maybe your world is a person, because we are all our own self-contained worlds with like a whole universe of stuff happening inside us. So keep an open mind about what a world can be. And as the world builder, it is entirely up to you. So many people make the mistake of thinking that world building is just about making the setting for a story, but it's so much more than that. World building is the texture that makes the world and any story that you put in it feel real. It's the way that people behave, the stories they believe, the food they eat, the way they interact with the environment around them. That is all world building, and you need it all for someone to feel truly immersed in your world and story. If you do your world building right, then it can actually help you with your story crafting. It can drive the plot forward. Imagine a world where there are a lot of natural disasters. A tornado comes along, that's going to drive some plot. It can also motivate character development and help you craft a character arc. I don't know, maybe you have a character who is part of a specific culture that you created for this world, and that is going to determine how they carry themselves and what they like their personal growth journey over the course of your story. I would like to remind you that you already know how to build worlds. As a human, you have been world building your entire life, even if you didn't realize it, because world building at its core really is just doing a mental simulation to imagine the consequences of different conditions at the start. And as humans, we are uniquely able to do this. There aren't other animals on Earth who have the mental capacity to do these complex simulations, this imaginative exercise. So we are already skilled at doing world building. We are uniquely capable of world building as humans. So what I'm just trying to get you to do with this course is think about your world building in a more intentional and logic-driven way. You are already a world builder, but let's just ratchet up to 11, okay? Now that we know what world building is, I would like you to take a moment to think about what some of your favorite fictional worlds are, worlds that other people have built. Are you a fan of the many worlds that they visited on Stargate? Are you a fan of Avatar? Both of them. The Last Airbender, where you get to think about these cool element-based magic system, or Avatar, the James Cameron movie, where you are transported to another planet. Whatever it is, whatever you're into, think about your favorite fictional worlds, because that will influence you. You have no choice. It's going to influence you in your own world building, either by telling you what little aspects of world building you liked and want to emulate in your worlds, or, this is equally important, telling you what about world building you don't like and what you don't want to do in your worlds. Keeping our favorite fictional worlds in mind, let's now get into my steps for crafting a world from scratch based on facts and science. It is a 6-step process. I ask you to ask yourself 6 questions in this order. So the first is, what is your intention for your world? What do you want to do with it? And this is a wide-reaching question, because it can encompass everything from what genre do you want this to be? Like, do you want it to be more fantasy or more science fiction? It can encompass, what do you want the vibe or aesthetic of your world to be? Do you want it to be dark and spooky and scary? Or do you want it to be super bright and light, happy, shining with lots of unicorns and rainbows? You can make that decision now. This is also the place where you're going to put in anything you know you want to exist in your world. Do you want there to be intelligent squid people? Well, you better make sure you have some oceans on your world. That's going to affect the decisions you make later. Do you know that it's going to be a world where queer people thrive and are welcome? That's going to lead you down a very different set of decisions than one where you want to point out and get your audience to think about issues surrounding climate change. So whatever you want to do with your world, decide that now, and that will influence your decisions. It will help guide your decisions later on in the process. The second question I want you to ask is, what makes your world different from our reality? And this can be a big difference, like maybe it's a totally different planet, maybe it orbits two stars, or it can be a really small difference, like maybe it's exactly Earth, but for some reason there are no squirrels. Or maybe it's something in between and slightly more consequential, like it's Earth, but the Library of Alexandria had never burned down, and we still have all of that knowledge with us today. So whatever makes your world different from our own, decide that here, and then determine what the rules of your world are. If you decide that there is magic in your world, how does that magic system work? If you decide that your world has slightly different physics, what are the physical rules of that world? And then when you know the rules, communicate them to your audience. You don't have to communicate all the rules, you don't have to give everything away, but your audience shouldn't be left in the dark. It shouldn't be wondering how your world works as they're going through the story, because it will distract them from engaging with the story. So come up with the rules and then decide what rules you have to communicate to your audience. And I'm going to tell you, it's a lot of them. Tell them a lot, not explicitly, not with an expositional information dump, but work it into your story to explain the world around it. The third question you should ask yourself actually is an optional question. Ask yourself how the world got that way. There are some stories, there are some worlds where you just want to start with the world how it is and not explain how it came to be that way, either because it doesn't serve the story or because you're just not interested in it. Again, you are the world builder, so all of these decisions are up to you. But there are some amazing stories where kind of the point of the story is to answer this question, how did the world get that way? If you've ever read N.K. Jemisin's Broken Earth trilogy, then you would know that a huge arc in that story is understanding how the Earth came to be broken. And so you can answer this question or not. It's totally up to you. But the fourth question is not optional. You need to answer this question, and it is, what's the environment of your world? This is the physical setting. It's what's the geology, what's the climate and weather patterns like, what physical resources are available, and how are they distributed? You need to set up your physical setting for the story before you start thinking about what type of people live there or what they believe in, because those other steps, the life form and the culture, those will be a result, a consequence of the type of environment you have. One thing that I have learned as an astronomer studying planets is how planets form. The planet forms first, and then any life that exists on that planet, unless they come from somewhere else, they are going to evolve to be adapted to that environment. So make your environment first, and then you can move on to question or step number 5, which is, what's the biology of your world? What types of life forms would have evolved to thrive, really, not just survive, but thrive in that environment? Their physical features and their biological needs should be informed by the environment around them. But as you will see in the biology lesson in this course, there is still a lot of room for randomness and creativity and imagination, even if you are, especially if you are being inspired by science. Science is not as limiting as you might think it is when it comes to inspiring creativity. Once you have your biology in place, you can start thinking about the culture. And this step number 6 is honestly where I spend most of my time when I am building a world, because culture is so huge. It encompasses what they believe, how they speak, what they eat, how they dress, how they react and interact with the environment around them. So you're going to spend a lot of time thinking about culture. And then when you have thought about the culture, you are not done. You have to iterate, because there are aspects of our culture that influence our environment. For example, we have a culture here in the US, where I am, of burning fossil fuels. There are other parts of the world that do that too, but it's especially big here. And that has affected our environment. There's now a lot of pollution in our air, in our water, and that has affected our biology. We now have more lung disease than we ever did before the Industrial Revolution pumped up a bunch of gas and other noxious material into our atmosphere. And so you can see that it's a cycle. So once you get to the end of the 6th step, go back a few times, see if any of your decisions would influence other aspects of your world, and do that a few times until you feel like you are done. When will you be done? That's a really great question. If you have a story in mind, I would recommend starting with the parts of your world that are directly relevant to your story, and then, if necessary, you can build out from there. If you don't have a story in mind and you're just building this world for fun, or because you want to create a space that is for and by you, where you can feel really comfortable, then you keep world building until you are done, until you don't want to anymore, until the space feels like it has achieved the intention that you set for your world. We're going to go through all of the basic concepts that I think you'll need to really build out a realistic environment, biology, and culture in future lessons. But here are some examples of questions that you might want to ask yourself when you're building your world. For environment, think about what type of planet or planets or person it is. Think about the distribution of different ecosystems. Are there oceans, mountains, forests, deserts? Most planets are going to have all of these across their surfaces, but think about how they're distributed, think about their relative sizes, think about how they interact with your intention for your world. Also, think about available resources. That is a great potential source of conflict. A lot of conflict happens over resource disputes. And think about potential natural disasters. Are there hurricanes or earthquakes or tsunamis that can happen in your world, and how is that going to affect everything else? For biology, start thinking about the physical traits of your species or multiple species. We have one dominant species here on Earth, but it doesn't have to be that way. And wouldn't it be a really interesting story to see how two equally intelligent and strong species on the same planet would interact? I would enjoy reading that story. When you are thinking about the physical traits of your biology, of whatever life form happens to live on your world, you have to think about their evolutionary history, if they're not human, because that will determine what they biologically need to survive. We have an evolutionary history as humans of being evolved from apes, so we have body hair and we have these dexterous digits, and if you are building a life form from scratch, it's really important to know that history and know where your life forms came from and what they need. It's always really fun to think about how life forms can reproduce. I love thinking of different ways that reproduction can happen. And in the sci-fi novel that I wrote, the life forms were heavily inspired by marine life here on Earth. So a lot of them, or they were, hermaphroditic. They had both male and female reproductive parts. So they had this really cool system of reproduction, which then led to a really interesting family structure that in no way resembles what we have here on Earth. And then think about what they need to do to survive. Not every being here on Earth needs to eat or sleep the way we do. They don't all have the same hierarchy of needs. They don't have Maslow's hierarchy. So think about what your life forms actually need and get creative with it, because that's where the fun of world building comes in. This is also where you can start thinking about any special abilities like magical powers or advanced genetic mutations or genetic interference where they give superpowers. This biology section is where you decide that, because this is the section where you're just thinking about what it's like to be a person on the world that you have created. And then you get to move on to culture, the big white whale of world building. This is where you're going to spend most of your time. Think about what they value, what they hold in high esteem. Do they value honesty or strength or kindness? Think about how they spend their time. Do they even have the time to do recreational activities, to do something just for fun? Or are they spending all of their time trying to survive? And what does it mean for them to survive? You will have decided that in your biology section. Think about what they believe in. This is close to, it's related to, but not the same as what they value. Think about whether they have any myths or religions. Think about if they have holidays, what rituals they do, what stories they tell. And then think about their aesthetic taste. What's beautiful to them? And I mean that both internally and externally. What type of fashion or architecture do they like? But also, what physical characteristics would make your life form like super hot, right? Like, imagine you have that intelligent squid species. What's a sexy squid look like? Ask yourself that question, because it is going to really inform how your characters interact on your world. Now, I said that all of these different features and aspects of your world are going to interact. That's why you have to iterate when you are answering those 6 questions to build your world. But one thing that might be helpful for you to think about is a phenomenon called the butterfly effect. This is an effect that means events have often random and unpredictable consequences that are based on the initial conditions. So whatever happens in the beginning will determine what happens later. And I know that that sounds obvious. It might sound really simple, but the point of the butterfly effect is that it's often hard to predict what's going to happen between those points, which leaves you a lot of room for imagination in your world building. But I'll give you a couple of examples. In the 1930s, wolves were eradicated from Yellowstone National Park, and they thought that that would have a really positive effect on the ecosystem. They thought that the elk populations would increase and that the populations of other animals would do well because they were no longer being hunted by these natural predators. But actually the opposite happened. So by the 1990s, the elk population was 3 times higher than it was in the 30s, which is great, but those elk didn't have to migrate. They didn't have to move around the park to evade the wolves, so they started overeating in specific areas of the park. They started overeating the willow trees by the rivers that ran through, and the beavers who ate those willow trees also, they no longer had a steady supply of food. So the beaver population fell and the rivers weren't as healthy anymore. So in 1995, scientists at the Yellowstone National Park decided to do this experiment where they reintroduced wolves to the park, and it has had incredible, unforeseen positive consequences. The elk population is still pretty high, but they have to move around to escape the wolves, so they aren't overeating the willow trees, which means those trees on the banks of the rivers have roots that are holding the banks in place. The rivers are healthier. The beavers now have a better source of food, and they are in healthier river ecosystems, so there are now 9 beaver colonies as opposed to the 1 beaver colony that there was before they started this project. And I love this example because scientists are still actively trying to understand how introducing this one species of wolf had this ripple effect through the entire ecosystem. So keep this in mind when you're building your worlds, that you can do something as simple and innocuous as introduce a single species or a single influence, and because of the butterfly effect, it will have drastic consequences further down the line. And I invite you to think about that process. Follow the logic, follow the chain, because if you don't follow the chain, if you just make up an outcome at the end, it will probably feel forced. And your audience, when they're consuming your story, they'll probably be able to tell that you did not follow this chain. And that is when you lose an audience, and you don't want to do that. Another great example of the butterfly effect is how the invention of brick actually paved the way for multi-room dwellings in medieval England. So after Rome fell and pulled back from England and the surrounding areas, a lot of the homes were actually one-room halls, the type that you might see or hear about in Norse folklore, these old Viking halls, right? When people gathered in these halls, they would usually surround a central hearth, a fire in the middle of the building. And because it was in the middle, smoke would carry up into the rafters of the building, and you couldn't really use that space. People had to huddle close to the fire because it wasn't actually really good at distributing the warmth throughout the room. But once they invented bricks, they were able to move this fire from the middle of the room to the edge of it in a brick hearth fireplace that actually does do a really good job of holding in the heat and then redistributing it to the space. It also takes the smoke out from the top of the room, which gives you so much more space to use. So they started dividing these halls into different areas for different people to sleep or different people to eat or do other activities. And I just love that you can see this connection between brick invention and the fact that, you know, in a lot of houses you have like a sitting room and a bedroom and a living room. I learned all of this from Bill Bryson's book At Home, and I just think it's a really great story. So when you are building your own worlds, keep this butterfly effect in mind. I actually think it's a really useful exercise to try and follow this logic chain to complete the chain of, okay, you have a certain type of environment on your world, do the mental exercise to think about what type of biology would thrive there. Or if you know you want to end up with a specific type of culture, well then what type of environment and biology do you have to make that culture happen? I'd like to tell you an example of a world that I built following this process. I called it the World of Freedom. It was an episode of Exolore, an early one when I first started the podcast. And I knew going into it, it was right around the time in 2020 when Black Lives Matter movements were really taking off, and it was a topic of conversation everywhere I went. I could not get this topic out of my mind. So I went into this world building session with the intention of creating a more mature and equitable world where people, but especially Black people, thrive and are welcome. So I went in with that intention, and I created a difference. I came up with a difference for this world that I thought would lead to that goal. So the difference was that the planet was physically larger than Earth. It was as large as a planet can be without crossing the boundary between rocky and gassy planets, which we think is around a little bit more than 1.5 times the size of Earth. With that difference in place, that meant that the environment was one where all of the continents on this planet were really isolated. They were far away from each other. There were a lot of resources available because there was just physically a lot of land and water for these people to extract resources from. Extraction doesn't have to be bad. You can extract ethically. We wanted to keep the biology as human. that was really important for our intention, but we recognized that there would probably be some small adaptations for the difference in environment. Like they would probably have more stamina because they have to travel farther distances on land. They probably have adaptations to deal with the stronger gravity that this planet would have. But we spent most of the time in this discussion thinking about the culture and how would culture be different if continents were so far apart that basically the Atlantic slave trade had never happened. So we had these isolated communities that had time and resources to mature socially and not feel the need to oppress others when they came in contact with them because they were already good. They had everything they needed. So I was really impacted by this world of freedom, and I think that demonstrates how world building can be great for stories. I still have a lot of ideas of stories I want to tell set in this world, but can also be a really valuable personal exercise. I created this world because I wanted to imagine a world where Black people hadn't been treated the way that we have for hundreds of years here on Earth. And I did that with other Black women, and it was a beautiful experience. And I got to follow my process. So that's an example of how it can work. I want to be really clear about why I say facts-based world building. Um, First of all, if you are basing your world on facts, that doesn't mean you have to only use facts. I just want you to be inspired by the facts. But here are a few concrete reasons why I think it's actually easier to build your world with facts and science in mind than to make things up on the spot. The first reason that I love facts-based world building is because it alleviates creative pressure. I was once asked to build a world for a gaming company for a Halloween promotion that they were putting on. So that gave me my intention right there. I knew that I wanted it to be a really spooky world. And I knew that I wanted it to be set in this underground forest that was inspired by Irish mythology. So I pictured this forest and I thought, how can I make this spooky? And I said to myself, oh, wouldn't it be so creepy if the trees were bleeding? And so I thought about how that might happen. I thought about the sap inside of trees, and maybe there are these beetles who are constantly crawling over the trees and eating the bark to make it look like the trees are bleeding. But then, how do I make it so that the tree sap is red? I could just decide that and set that as the decision, or I could research tree sap colors, and I did that. I gave away the ending. I did that. But in my research, I found that nutmeg trees have a sap that is reddish in color, and it just clicked for me. I realized if I make all of the trees in this spooky forest nutmeg trees, then they still achieve that spooky bleeding effect, but also the forest smells like Christmas. And the juxtaposition between something that is usually, for a lot of people, very comforting and this spooky, bloody element, I loved that juxtaposition. It made the world feel spookier but still grounded in reality. And that is the sweet spot. That is what facts-based world building can do. I say that it grounds your work in reality, and that's good because it makes your world feel familiar and more relatable for your audience. Because let's be honest, your audience is going to come into your world with expectations, and their expectations are probably going to be grounded in what they've experienced here in real life. So they understand inside themselves, even if they don't know the science of it, they understand how gravity works. They understand that things are heavy. They understand how climate works and how seasons can change. So they're going to bring that with them to your world. And if your world deviates from that, and you don't explain how or why, then your audience is constantly going to be in the back of their minds, or maybe even in the front of their minds, thinking, Why doesn't this match my expectations? What's going on here? And your audience might get confused, they might even get upset, and then they won't want to engage with your story or your world anymore, and that's not what we want. And I think that it's also great to do facts-based world building, especially in the way that I do it, because it teaches while it entertains. It implicitly reinforces those expectations that people have about the physical rules underpinning the world that we live in. And as a science communicator, I am here for all sorts of fun teaching. So that's why facts-based world building. I want you to keep in mind as you go through your own world building journey and as you go through the rest of this course that consistency is key. Once you set up the rules of your world, you have to stick to them. Keep asking yourself, does this make sense based on what I have already decided? And if it doesn't make sense, then you either have to change that decision or you have to change the decision that came before it. And that means that world building is hard. You have to keep track of the decisions you make, but it also means that world building is a really rewarding process when you get it right. I touched on this a little bit before, but remember that world building can be an endless process. There are authors who spend months of their writing on the world building before they even start the writing. And unfortunately, a lot of that doesn't actually show in the story. Sometimes people talk about world building, good world building, as an iceberg, because there's going to be about 20% of the world building work that you do see in the story, but there's another big chunk, an 80% chunk underneath the water that the audience doesn't see, but it has to be there to hold the entire iceberg afloat. So a lot of the work that you do in your world building probably won't be seen by the audience, but that doesn't make it any less important. And then my final piece that I will leave you with about world building based on facts is that you have to know how your own world works, how everything is connected and what makes it feel real before you can build a fictional world, which is why I am using this course to give you the basic fundamental concepts in these different topics like geology and biology and political science, and I'm trying to give you those pieces of information because that information will make your fictional world feel real. But I don't want you to stop at this course. I mentioned Bill Bryson's At Home book before, which taught me a lot about the evolution of a house, and that's something I never thought I would be interested in, but it is useful in world building. Read about history, read about influential figures, read about the natural world around us, and then incorporate what you learn into your worlds. Because the way that I do it, world building is the beautiful marriage of science and imagination. And you can have all the imagination you want, but if you don't have the factual underpinning, then it's not going to connect. So please keep that in mind, that you should constantly be learning. And I will help you do that learning, because in the next lesson in this course, I'm going to be covering the basics of your world's astronomy. We're going to start right from the beginning, the planet formation process. I'll teach you how planets form, what the different possible conditions of planets are, so that you know everything you need to know to choose and start crafting your world. So this has been your introduction to building a world based on facts. Hopefully by this point you know the 6 steps in the process, you understand the importance and the freedom that you get when you use science to inspire your creativity, and you will see throughout the rest of the course that the science does not limit you. It expands your possibilities while also giving you a guide to what is possible, which lets you know like what to do when you want to step away from that guide, right? You have to know the facts to be able to effectively deviate from them. And that's what we're going to cover in the rest of the lessons. So thank you so much for watching this video, and you will see me in the next one.